New Year's Eve, 1944. As the world prepared to celebrate a new beginning, thousands of young American men were bracing for what might be their last day on Earth. Lieutenant Glenn Rogon sat in the cockpit of his B-17 Flying Fortress, the Little Skipper, staring into the frozen skies ahead. Beside him, his co-pilot, William Lake, checked gauges with calm precision, but both men knew this mission was different. They were headed for Hamburg. The city was a fortress of flak and steel, a vital Nazi stronghold with oil refineries that kept Hitler's war machine alive. Destroying it wasn't just another bombing run, it was a blow meant to end the war faster, and maybe, just maybe, save millions of lives. Behind them flew an armada of B-17s, big, beautiful birds they called flying fortresses. But those fortresses had soft hearts. Inside each were 10 boys barely past 20, holding photos of sweethearts, letters from home, and a prayer in their pocket. For many, this would be their first real taste of combat. For others, it might be their last. But for Rogon, this was about duty. Not glory, not revenge, just the quiet belief that freedom was worth flying into fire for. And so, as the engines roared and the sun rose behind their wings, the Little Skipper and its crew crossed into enemy skies, straight into the mouth of hell. But no one could have predicted what would happen next. The firestorm over Hamburg. The skies above Hamburg weren't blue that morning. They were black. As the Little Skipper approached the target zone, the sky erupted. It wasn't rain. It wasn't clouds. It was flak. Dark bursts of anti-aircraft fire, spewing metal and smoke like angry thunder. Lieutenant Rogon tightened his grip on the control yoke. Around him, the formation held tight, rows of B-17s flying in near-perfect symmetry. But perfection doesn't last long in a storm of steel. One moment you're flying with your brothers, the next, they vanish. One B-17 took a direct hit. Engines flaming, it spiraled downward in a corkscrew of death. Another lost a wing and cartwheeled through the clouds. Rogon and Lake could only watch as silver specks turned into falling stars. It was chaos. "Bombs away!" the bombardier finally shouted over the intercom. The belly of the Little Skipper opened, releasing a string of 500-pound bombs that tumbled toward the smoking refineries below. Fire lit up the ground, and for a brief moment success seemed real. But then came the fighters, German Me-262s. Jets faster than anything the Americans had ever seen sliced through the formation like razors. One swept overhead, guns blazing, and disappeared before anyone could blink. Next came the BF-109s and FW-190s, swarming like wasps, tearing through the B-17s from all directions. The sky wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a slaughterhouse. To Rogon's right, Faithful Forever took a hit to the fuselage. Lieutenant Leo Ross's voice crackled on the radio. "She's going down." Seconds later, parachutes bloomed behind the falling bird. Tiny dots of hope in a hopeless sky. Inside the Little Skipper, the crew held their breath. Every gunner scanned the clouds, firing at shadows. The air smelled of cordite, oil, and fear. Then came a cry of hope. "P-51s, we've got cover!" American Mustangs stormed into view, diving like angels with wings of vengeance. The German fighters broke off. Some vanished, others exploded in midair. Cheers erupted over the intercom. But the victory was brief. The P-51s had other bombers to protect. And soon, the Little Skipper was alone again. The mission wasn't over. Not even close. They were still deep in enemy territory, flying wounded and vulnerable. And what none of them knew was that the worst was yet to come. Collision in the clouds. They were almost out of Hamburg when the sky betrayed them. The Little Skipper had just turned toward the North Sea. The worst seemed over, until the heavens erupted again. Flak bursts exploded so close that the plane shook like a leaf in a storm. Shrapnel tore through the wings, rattling the fuselage like hail on a tin roof. "Hold formation!" Rogon shouted. But holding formation in hell is easier said than done. Ahead of them flew 9 Lives, the lead bomber of their group. She was beautiful once, silver, proud, steady. But now, her nose was riddled with holes, smoke trailing from an engine. Rogan watched her struggle to climb back into line. Then came the call no pilot ever wants to hear. Enemy fighters at 11 o'clock high. Before anyone could react, a Messerschmitt streaked across the formation, spitting fire. 9 Lives took a burst straight through the cockpit. In an instant, both pilots were gone. Yet the bomber kept flying, unmanned, silent, rising. Rogan's instincts screamed. He pulled the little skipper hard to the left, searching for her in the clouds. And then, he saw it. The crippled 9 Lives was drifting, right toward them. "Where's 9 Lives?" Lake yelled. "Too close, way too close." The 2 bombers closed in, locked on a collision course at 200 miles an hour. Rogan's hands flew over the controls, yanking the yoke, throttling down, but the air was rough, the response too slow. A heartbeat later, the sky exploded in metal and fire. The sound wasn't a bang. It was a scream, a twisting, tearing roar as steel met steel. 9 Lives rammed into the little skipper's belly, her nose piercing straight through the aluminum skin. Inside, chaos. The plane jolted violently, panels ripped free, wires sparked. The world turned sideways. "Jesus! What was that?" Lake shouted. "Everyone report!" Rogon barked into the intercom, but all he heard was static and panic. The bomber was trembling, groaning like a wounded beast. Then, a stunned voice from the gunner's position. "Sir, you're not going to believe this. We're sitting on top of another plane." Rogan looked out the side window and froze. Below them, locked in a grotesque embrace, 9 Lives was still attached. 2 bombers, 1 sky, 1 impossible nightmare. And somehow, both were still flying. But inside those tangled fuselages, 1 man was still alive and praying. Russo's final prayer. Inside the tangled fortress of steel and smoke, chaos gave way to silence. A strange, heavy silence. The kind that only comes after a miracle or just before the end. Sergeant Joe Russo, the ball turret gunner of the little skipper, was still alive. Barely. The collision had crushed his tiny glass sphere against the belly of 9 Lives. Metal twisted around him like a coffin. He couldn't move, couldn't see the sky anymore. Only flickers of flame licking at the seams. "Joe, can you hear me?" came a voice through the intercom. It was Elkin, one of the waist gunners. A pause, then a weak reply. Yeah, I can hear you." His voice trembled, but not with fear. It was steady, peaceful, almost resigned. They tried to free him. Wrenches, crowbars, bare hands clawing at the mangled frame. Nothing moved. The turret was sealed tight, fused by fire. "Hold on, Joe, we'll get you out." But Russo already knew the truth. He could feel the heat creeping in. He could hear the faint crackle of ammunition cooking off nearby. And so, instead of calling for help, he began to pray. "Oh God, please, now be with us in this trial." His words came softly over the headset. The other crewmen went silent, listening. Every man, somewhere in the wreckage, bowed his head. "Lord, don't leave me alone. Be with me always." Lieutenant Lake removed his helmet. Rogon turned down the intercom. He couldn't bear it. Later, Lake would say, "I felt like I was intruding on a sacred moment. A man's last conversation with his maker." Outside, the 2 bombers burned together, locked in a fiery embrace. Inside, Joe Russo whispered the last words he would ever speak. "God be with me, don't let go." A flash, a crack, and then silence again. Not of death, but of peace. In the middle of war, a man had found calm. And though his body would never return home, his prayer still echoes through the story of the little skipper. A voice of faith above the flames. But Rogon and Lake didn't have time to grieve. The fire was spreading fast, and if they didn't act, everyone else would follow Russo into eternity. The impossible piloting. Smoke filled the cockpit. The oxygen masks hissed with every breath. The smell of burning oil was everywhere. Rogan grabbed the control yoke with both hands, fighting to keep the little skipper steady. But it wasn't just his plane anymore. Another B-17, 9 lives, was fused beneath them, her nose buried deep into the aluminum belly. 2 planes, 8 engines, 1 impossible beast.
Maintain altitude.
"Bill, check hydraulics," Rogan shouted. "Still got pressure, but she's heavy, Glenn. Real heavy." Lake's hands were slick with sweat, his knuckles white around the throttles. They could feel the drag pulling them down. 200,000 pounds of metal, fire, and dying dreams trying to fall out of the sky. Below them, the North Sea shimmered like a sheet of ice. If they dropped now, they'd vanish in seconds. No rescue, no bodies, just cold water and names on a wall. "Not the sea," Rogon muttered. "We need land. We jump over land." He knew what that meant. They had to turn the piggyback monster. 2 crippled bombers locked together, making a 180-degree turn toward the German coast. It was suicide. "Glenn, if we bank, the whole thing might break apart," Lake warned. Rogan's jaw tightened. "If we don't, we die anyway." He throttled down 2 engines, pulled back on the yoke, and whispered, "Easy now. Come on, girl." The beast groaned. The wings flexed. For a moment, it felt like the planes were tearing each other apart. The controls kicked against his hands. Metal screeched. Flames licked the left wing. Then she started to turn. Slowly. Painfully. Miraculously. "Bill, it's working!" Lake looked out the window and saw the coastline emerging through the smoke, brown earth and green fields beneath the haze. Home wasn't behind them anymore. It was right ahead. But victory had a price. Flames from 9 lives were spreading fast, licking into the little skipper's wing root. The heat grew unbearable. Paint blistered, instruments warped. Rogan could feel it on his face, like flying through an oven. He glanced at Lake. The man was exhausted, covered in soot, but still there, still flying beside him. 2 men, side by side, fighting a machine that should not have been able to fly. Rogan exhaled and whispered under his breath, "Just hold together a little longer." And for a moment, the sky obeyed. But the miracle couldn't last forever. As they neared the German coast, a new danger awaited, one that could finish what the collision had started. The last turn to land. The German coastline appeared like a ghost through the haze, gray, distant, and unreal. But to Rogon and Lake, it looked like salvation. Both men were drenched in sweat despite the freezing altitude. Their hands bled from gripping the controls too tight. The cockpit rattled as if the entire ship was trying to shake itself apart. "Bill, we're almost there," Rogan gasped. "Yeah," Lake replied, forcing a grin. "Just keep her level." They were at 15,000 feet, flames crawling up the left wing. The heat was so fierce that the paint blistered and curled. Smoke seeped into the cockpit, stinging their eyes. Every few seconds, a muffled explosion came from below, ammo cooking off inside 9 lives. Behind them, the surviving crew were getting ready to jump, parachutes strapped, faces black with soot. Each man paused for a moment to look forward, to the 2 silhouettes in the cockpit, still fighting for their lives. Then Rogon's voice cracked through the intercom.
What about you and Lieutenant Lake?
"We're almost over land. Get ready to bail. Jump as soon as I give the word." He didn't have to say more. They all knew what it meant. There would be no jumping for the pilots. Elkin, one of the gunners, hesitated. "Sir, what about you and Lieutenant Lake?"
Copy.
Rogan smiled
Clear,
faintly.
Lake.
"We'll be right behind you." It was a lie, but a kind one. One by one, the men disappeared into the smoke, falling toward freedom. Soon, the only voices left on the radio were Rogan's and Lake's. The plane creaked under the strain. Flames had reached the cockpit windows. Bits of molten metal dropped onto the floor, hissing like acid. The heat pressed against their faces. Unbearable, suffocating. Rogan turned to his co-pilot.
Roll.
"Bill, you need to go.
You can't
That's an
hold her
order."
alone.
Lake didn't move. He stared straight ahead, calm and steady.
I'm staying, Glenn.
For a moment, neither spoke. Only the roar of the engines filled the void. Then Lake said quietly, "If I leave, she'll roll. You can't hold her alone." "Bill, I'm staying, Glenn." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't defiance. It was brotherhood. The kind that's forged in smoke, blood, and sky. Rogan's throat tightened. There were no more words left, just a nod. Two men side by side, facing the inevitable. Ahead of them, the earth was rushing up fast. Fields, trees, rooftops, all blending into a blur of brown and green. "Hold her steady," Rogon whispered. Lake smiled through the smoke. "I've got you." And together, they pulled back on the yoke one last time. What happened next would defy every law of flight and every expectation of death. Crash and survival. The fields of northern Germany rushed toward them like a rising tide. 15,000 feet. 10,000. 5. Every alarm in the cockpit screamed. Every gauge flickered red. The bombers were shaking apart, shedding fragments of metal like feathers in the wind. "Hold her straight," Rogon yelled. "I'm with you," Lake shouted back, teeth clenched. They were flying what no man had ever flown before. Two dying planes fused into one. A burning monument to chaos and courage. Below, on the island of Wangerooge, German soldiers looked up in disbelief. Through their binoculars, they saw a sight no one could explain. Two B-17s welded together, falling yet still flying. Their commander shouted, "Cease fire, don't shoot, those poor devils are finished." The final seconds felt eternal. Rogan and Lake could see the rooftops now. A windmill, a barn, a field of frozen earth. The engines screamed, coughing smoke and flame. Rogan pulled back with every ounce of strength he had left. "Easy, girl. Just a little more." Then, impact. The world became white fire and thunder. Metal shrieked. Wood exploded. The nose of 9 lives tore into the ground, catapulting the little skipper upward like a slingshot. For a split second, she was airborne again. A dying bird, refusing to fall. Then came the second crash. The little skipper slammed down on her belly, skidding through a barn, ripping off her left wing in a spray of wood and dirt. The cockpit lurched forward, slammed, stopped, silence. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then a cough, a breath, a groan. Rogan opened his eyes. Light, smoke, pain. But he was alive. Beside him, Lake stirred, bloody, bruised, but breathing. They looked at each other, dazed, as the reality set in. They had survived. Lake crawled out first, kicking away shattered glass and twisted metal. He stumbled into the daylight, into a field covered in debris and burning wreckage. The air reeked of fuel. He reached for a cigarette, his hands trembling, and struck a match. Before he could light it, a German voice barked, "Halt!" A young Wehrmacht soldier stood a few feet away, rifle raised, but his eyes weren't angry. They were wide with disbelief. "What's Max do?
Bleiben Sie hier!
He'll set us all on fire!" he yelled, pointing at the leaking gasoline streaming from the wing. For the first time that day, Lake laughed. A wild, broken laugh of a man who had stared at death and somehow walked away. Within hours, both men would be captured. But 6 of the little skipper's crew survived that day. And against all odds, 4 men from 9 lives lived too. 2 bombers, 20 men, 10 souls came home. Yet even after the war, Rogan would never call himself a hero. To him, the real courage belonged to someone else, the man who stayed beside him to the very end. Legacy and brotherhood. Years later, Glenn Rogan rarely spoke about that day. He lived quietly. A husband, a father, a man who mowed his own lawn and waved to neighbors who never knew what he'd survived. When people asked about the medal on his mantle, he would simply say, "It's not mine. It belongs to the man who stayed." That man was William Lake. In every retelling, Rogan made sure people knew it. He'd always end the story the same way. He could have jumped. He didn't. And because of that, I got to grow old. It wasn't about heroism. It wasn't about war. It was about brotherhood, that invisible thread that binds men together when everything else falls apart. Two pilots, in a world consumed by fire, chose loyalty over survival. As for Sergeant Joe Russo, the gunner who prayed in his final moments, his name is carved into a memorial stone in his hometown of Boston. Every year, Rogon sent flowers. Every year, he whispered the same quiet prayer. God be with him. He's the reason I still believe in miracles. Decades later, Rogon's daughter, Cindy, would write The Piggyback Flight, a pilot's journey, a book preserving the incredible story her father never saw as his own. Through her words, the legend of the little skipper and 9 lives lives on, not as a tale of war, but of faith, courage, and the quiet kind of love that soldiers rarely talk about. Because sometimes miracles don't fall from heaven. Sometimes they're flown by 2 men holding on when the sky itself is falling apart. And if this story moved you, share it. Because somewhere out there, another generation needs to remember that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stays.